Hey guys, tonight we will explore together the dramatic story of Thomas Cromwell, the Earl of Essex, the powerful hand behind every twist in the reign of Henry VIII, but who was ultimately accused of treason and heresy in a wrongful verdict, and then beheaded on Tower Hill. Do you think Cromwell truly committed treason, or was he merely a victim of a political conspiracy? And to unravel this question, let us examine the turning points, the power plays, and the betrayals behind this shocking case. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please leave a comment below, letting me know where you live and what time it is in your local time zone right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine yourself drifting back to the summer of 1540, when London lay cloaked in a heavy, almost otherworldly fog, each lantern's glow swallowed by the damp air. Tower Hill emerged from the mist like a silent stage, poised to witness an extraordinary reversal of fortune. There, Thomas Cromwell, once hailed as the Earl of Essex, and known as the king's most trusted architect of power, stood shackled and subdued. The very foundations of the Tudor court, which he had so deftly shaped, now quivered under the weight of his downfall. More than 3 decades earlier, Cromwell had been born the son of a humble blacksmith in the riverside village of Putney. His childhood had offered little promise, yet he learned early to turn adversity into advantage. A violent quarrel with his father drove him abroad, where he wandered through foreign battlefields as a mercenary, then into bustling trading halls across continental Europe. In Italy, he steeped himself in the ruthless political theories of Machiavelli and immersed himself in the intricacies of Renaissance banking. Those lessons became the bedrock of his extraordinary ascendancy upon returning to England. By the mid-1520s, he attracted the notice of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the dominant minister under Henry VIII. Cromwell's mastery of both canon and civil law made him indispensable in the cardinal's household, particularly during the fraught negotiations to annul the king's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. When Wolsey's star finally fell in 1529, dragged down by his failure to secure that annulment, Cromwell withdrew just enough to avoid the stain of disgrace, yet remained indispensable to the crown. In 1932, he claimed the position of principal secretary to the monarch, a foothold that propelled him into the highest circles of power. From there, he orchestrated the English Reformation, severing ties with Rome, dissolving ancient monasteries to swell the royal coffers, and dismantling the entrenched might of the Catholic Church. His reforms enriched Henry's treasury and strengthened royal authority, while his network of spies and informers spread across every shire, ensuring that loyalty to the crown was the only currency that mattered. Yet those same instruments of authority, the courts he had refined, the statutes he had crafted, the intelligence he had amassed, turned inexorably against him. On June 10th, 1540, Cromwell entered the council chamber at Westminster, unaware that his every step had been charted by his most determined adversaries. Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, leader of the Conservative faction and veteran of countless court intrigues, rose to deliver a meticulously prepared indictment. The charges of treason and heresy were read aloud, each accusation steeped in legal precision and laced with dramatic flourish. Cromwell, once the master of such proceedings, stood dumbfounded as the noose tightened around him. Before his peers, he was stripped of the insignia of the Order of the Garter, an honour he had worn with pride only weeks before his ceremonial sword was wrenched from his side, and iron shackles were fastened to his wrists. The sudden transformation from a peer of the realm to a common criminal sent shudders through the assembly. Courtiers who had once jockeyed desperately for his favour now averted their eyes, fearful that a glance of sympathy might seal their own doom. In the days that followed, Cromwell's public humiliation unfolded as a grim spectacle. He was paraded through London streets, a captive in iron, mocked by onlookers who once revered his ruthlessness. The very populace that had marvelled at his efficiency in crushing rebellions and uprooting monastic strongholds now gawked at his broken figure, a hushed reminder that proximity to supreme power offered no immunity. Yet it was Tower Hill that became the ultimate stage for his shattering finale. On that elevated platform, constructed to command the gaze of thousands, Cromwell awaited his fate. The air was thick with tension. The murmur of the crowd, like a low chant, echoing his own racing thoughts. In that final twilight before dawn, he delivered a measured speech, no defiant proclamations. Nodis perate pleas. He spoke humbly of human frailty, offered prayers for the king, and entreated God's mercy. Then, with a single stroke of the executioner's axe, the life of England's most formidable minister was extinguished. In the hush that followed, Tower Hill stood silent once more, as if marking the end of an era. The fragment of Cromwell's legacy that lingered was twofold: a cautionary tale of how swiftly the favour of a monarch could turn to fury, and the enduring imprint of reforms that reshaped English governance, though he fell by the very tools he had forged. Cromwell's narrative remains etched into history as a meditation on the perilous allure of power and the capriciousness of fortune. Now, as you drift back to this distant summer night, allow the story to settle in your mind like the lingering fog over London's rooftops. For in Thomas Cromwell's rise and ruin, we find both the promise and the peril that accompany any great ambition. Close your eyes for a moment, breathe in deeply, and let your mind settle as we journey back to Putney. On the outskirts of London, at a misty dawn in the year 1485, Thomas Cromwell was born into the grinding poverty and harshness of the Wilson family. His father, a diligent blacksmith, spent his days hammering glowing steel in the forge, while his mother, Mrs. May, ran a small riverside tavern, always offering warm ginger ale with a smile to passing travellers. Mrs. May recalled that young Thomas was a shy child who loved to sit by the furnace, listening to the rhythm of pounding iron, as if he found the heartbeat of the world there. The Cromwell household had little comfort. Every meal was barely enough, and laughter flickered like a dying candle. Thomas had a younger sister named Elizabeth, who tended cattle in the fields and often brought him scraps of bread whenever he sneaked into an empty shed to read old, tattered books. Mrs. May arranged for Cromwell to study with a nearby priest, but poverty meant the holy texts were missing pages. So Thomas taught himself from discarded scraps of paper and library scrapings. One day, when Thomas carelessly inscribed letters on the forge wall, his father flew into a rage and struck him hard, igniting a bitter quarrel. Humiliated and bruised, Cromwell quietly left home before dawn, carrying only a filthy cloth sack and a heart full of yearning for the unknown. He resolved to leave Putney forever, to abandon the image of his father at the roaring forge, and to venture across the sea to a continent that promised greater opportunity. At first, he joined a company of mercenaries, roaming across Europe to earn his keep. In the brutal battles of Flanders and Italy, Cromwell learned military discipline and understood that life hung by a thread. Yet the battlefield was merely a bridge to a greater passion, commerce, and politics. When the fighting subsided, Cromwell arrived in Florence, then Venice, two Renaissance centres where art, science, and finance converged. There, he immersed himself in knowledge. Cromwell devoured the works of Machiavelli, who taught that the ends justify the means, and studied the banking operations of the Medici family. Learning how they managed credit, oversaw treasury operations, and brokered diplomatic negotiations, he would sit by candlelight into the night, taking notes on business strategies and the mechanics of power. Compared to his English peers, accustomed to conservative feudal life, Cromwell stood out. He spoke Italian like a native, grasped both canon and civil law, and could converse with local nobility. When he returned to England in the early 1520s, Cromwell was not merely an exile come home, but a man from another world. He quickly caught the attention of Cardinal Wolsey, the nation's most powerful minister after King Henry VIII. Although Wolsey's influence spanned the palace, he needed Cromwell to draft intricate terms, most crucially, the king's divorce from Catherine of Aragon. To Wolsey, Cromwell was an exceptional legal mind, skillfully balancing ecclesiastical law and royal prerogative. When Wolsey fell from grace in the year 1529 for failing to persuade the Pope to grant the annulment, many of his allies scattered in panic. Yet Cromwell, guided by a sharp instinct, stepped back to avoid suspicion and stepped forward to earn the king's trust. He hovered at the court's edges, then suddenly appeared before Henry with a bold legal solution: sever ties with the Holy See, transfer ecclesiastical authority to the crown, and appropriate church lands for the royal treasury. In the year 1542, Cromwell was formally appointed Principal Secretary, the King's right hand. From that position, he launched the English Reformation, breaking from the Roman Church, dissolving the monasteries, and enriching the crown with vast confiscated wealth. In the shadowy politics of the court, these achievements rendered him indispensable. Yet Cromwell's maneuvers were not purely enlightened. He also sowed fear. He built a network of informants and made charges of heresy a weapon against his rivals. Thus, Cromwell, from impoverished Putney boy to powerful earl, stands as a testament to the force of knowledge and ambition, yet also a warning about the perils of absolute loyalty and the danger of concentrating too much power in one individual. As the London wind whistles through the chimneys, let this tale lull you into a reverie of an age when glory soared and plummeted in an instant, like a leaf drifting through the mist. When Thomas Cromwell returned to England, his mind still echoing with the lessons of continental courts and banking houses, he found the Tudor court awash in the familiar haze of ambition and intrigue. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, then the most powerful figure after King Henry VIII himself, seemed to hold every political string in his well-manicured hands. Into this tumultuous arena stepped Cromwell, whose reputation for legal acumen and worldly cunning had already begun to precede him. At first, Cromwell quietly eased into Wolsey's inner circle, observing the cardinal's style, the measured tones, the whispered counsel, the careful balancing of noble interests. Yet it was Cromwell's ability to navigate ecclesiastical and civil law with equal deftness that soon marked him as indispensable. He drafted clauses, annotated decrees, and passed ancient statutes with the ease of a scholar of both canon and common law. When Wolsey's grand negotiations to secure King Henry's annulment from Catherine of Aragon ended in failure in the year 1529, many under Wolsey's wing scattered like startled birds. But Cromwell, with his characteristic shrewdness, distanced himself just enough to avoid disgrace, then pivoted toward the monarch, offering his talents to the very ruler whose marital desires had ignited this storm. By the month of April in 1532, King Henry formally appointed Cromwell as his principal secretary. This position, perched as close to the throne as any servant could hope, granted him authority to draft the king's proclamations, propose new policies, and oversee court ceremonies. In those quiet moments after the grand processions and lavish feasts, Cromwell would sit cramped behind a heavy oak desk, quill in hand, refining the language that would soon echo through the halls of power. From this vantage, he set in motion his vision of a stronger, more centralized monarchy. In the year 1534, Cromwell introduced the legislation later known as the Act of Supremacy, formally declaring King Henry VIII as the supreme head of the Church of England. With that single stroke of the pen, centuries-old ties to Rome were severed, and the king's spiritual and temporal authority became one and the same. Then, with a detached efficiency born of long nights, spent poring over ledgers and legal tomes, Cromwell oversaw the dissolution of the monasteries. Monastic lands, once bastions of conservative resistance, were surveyed, catalogued, and transferred into royal hands. The wealth thus confiscated replenished the royal treasury and funded the king's ventures, while simultaneously eroding the power base of any who might challenge the crown's supremacy. Cromwell's methods, however, were not guided by sentiment. He constructed an intricate web of informers, trusted men in distant shires. Loyal clerics turned agents, even merchants who carried news in their ledgers. Each piece of intelligence found its way back to a network of darkened rooms and sealed correspondence, where Cromwell and his closest allies would sift truth from rumour. Plotting the removal of any who showed signs of disloyalty, reports were compiled, allegations drafted, and when the time was ripe, accusations of treason or heresy were unleashed, like trapdoors beneath unsuspecting courtiers. To ensure the smooth operation of his new royal bureaucracy, Cromwell established rigorous auditing procedures, demanding meticulous accounts from tax collectors and estate managers. Invoices, receipts, and inventories were examined with a cold, analytical eye, guaranteeing that every coin destined for the crown actually reached the royal coffers. No longer could a local magistrate skim from the poor box or a land steward misreport harvest yields. The machinery of state became a finely tuned instrument under Cromwell's guidance, humming with quiet efficiency. In just 10 years' time, Cromwell had risen from anonymous royal clerk to the unacknowledged architect of Tudor governance. His fingerprints were visible on every reform: the centralization of power, the expansion of a professional bureaucracy, and the entrenchment of statutory law over feudal custom. He deftly walked the razor's edge between competing factions, balancing the king's desires, placating reformers and conservatives alike, and ensuring that his own influence remained both indispensable and discreet. Yet, for all his achievements, Cromwell retained the patience of the scholar and the air of the observer. He moved through palace corridors with measured steps, spoke in calm, unhurried tones, and wore simple attire that belied the vast power he wielded. His rise was not a blaze of glory, but a steady accumulation of trust and competence, a testament to the age-old truth that knowledge and persistence can shape kingdoms. As you surrender to the gentle rhythm of this tale, imagine cloistered chambers where legal texts gather dust, only to be breathed to life by Cromwell's quill. Envision quiet courtyards where spies discreetly exchange letters beneath moonlight, and picture candlelit desks piled high with ledgers that record the fortunes of a realm. In the tapestry of Tudor history, Cromwell's thread weaves through every page, binding crown and country in a tighter embrace than ever before. And though his methods could chill the heart, they irrevocably forged a path toward modern statecraft, leaving an indelible imprint on the future of England's monarchy. After seizing supreme authority, Thomas Cromwell embarked upon a relentless phase of reform that would forever alter the landscape of English, religious, and political life. From 1536 to 1541, under the sweeping program known as the Dissolution of the Monasteries, hundreds of Catholic monasteries across the realm were systematically suppressed. Their lands, treasures, and revenues were seized for the royal treasury, swelling its coffers by an astonishing sum, approximately £1,300,000 in the currency of that era. Yet this was no mere exercise in fiscal enrichment. By dismantling the monasteries, Cromwell simultaneously extinguished the bastions of conservative opposition to his reforms, depriving dissenting voices of both sanctuary and patronage. With a discreet hand, Cromwell deployed the seized wealth in strategic acts of patronage. He rewarded loyal officials with grants of former monastic lands, thereby binding their fortunes to the success of the crown. He extended pensions to soldiers who had served in the king's wars, offered dowries to the daughters of faithful courtiers, and even eased the tax burden on the poorest parishes, granting alms from monastic endowments to the needy. These gestures softened resistance in pockets of unrest, lending a veneer of benevolence to what might otherwise have been perceived as ruthless expropriation. Parallel to these fiscal maneuvers, Cromwell wove the first true network of intelligence in English history. Agents and informers, cloaked in the ordinary garb of merchants, farmers, and minor clerics, were stationed from the royal courts of London to the remote villages of Cornwall. Secret letters were penned in cipher, dispatched by courier under the cover of night, and delivered to Cromwell's own private chambers. In those dimly lit rooms, he pored over reports of murmured sedition, overheard prayers for the Pope, or unease among the landed gentry. In his eyes, the information was the lodestar by which every political decision must be guided. He did not hesitate to deploy this knowledge in the service of security. Suspected traitors were summoned under pretext of private consultation, led into vaults beneath the palace, where the echo of dripping water and distant footsteps deepened the sense of dread. There, Cromwell's inquisitors would brandish ancient letters and twisted declarations as evidence, employing the terror of psychological torment. No lash was needed. The mere threat that one's own words might be reread as heresy was often enough to break any resistance. Accusations carried the weight not just of law, but of betrayal so personal that even the most stalwart soul could waver. In tandem with these secret operations, Cromwell overhauled the machinery of government itself. He codified the responsibilities and limits of every office, compelling justices of the peace, sheriffs, and bailiffs to maintain meticulous account books. Ledgers, once neglected, became sacrosanct, recording every toll, tithe, and penalty with unerring precision. He established specialized courts dubbed Star Chambers, by some dedicated to the swift adjudication of political and religious offences. These tribunals, though feared for their severity, brought a new transparency to governance. Processes were recorded, sentences pronounced, and executions carried out in the glare of public notice. Through these measures, the Tudor state shed much of its medieval opacity. Authority flowed downward from the monarch, through a disciplined bureaucracy, rather than being dispersed among feudal lords. The result was a form of modern statecraft, one that prized uniformity, accountability, and the rule of law. Cromwell's name became synonymous with efficiency. His reforms, with the promise of a kingdom both stronger and more coherent than ever before. Yet for all this success, Cromwell's achievements bred a quiet but potent hostility. The traditional nobility, dispossessed of ancestral lands, nursed grievances behind closed doors. Former monks and abbots, deprived of their livelihoods, whispered of divine retribution. Even those officials, elevated by Cromwell, grew wary, fearing that their own next promotions might be the prelude to a fall. In every hall and tavern, rumours circulated of Cromwell's unchecked power and the precarious fate of any man who placed too much trust in royal favour. By the year 1540, Cromwell stood at the pinnacle of his influence. As Earl of Essex, he was the kingdom's chief architect of policy, the steady hand guiding the wheels of state. Yet the very frameworks he had wrought, statutes, intelligence networks, and administrative hierarchies, were now tools his enemies knew well. They studied his methods in secret councils, compiled dossiers on his agents, and plotted to turn his own instruments of control against him. In the court's dark corners, they whispered of how one day Cromwell might be ensnared by the same legal snare he had perfected. Thus, as the smoke of monastic chimneys faded from the horizon and the statutes of supremacy echoed through the land, Cromwell's fate, sealed by the structures he had built, loomed ever nearer. His consolidation of power had been masterful. Yet it had also woven a tapestry of resentment that threatened to unravel his life with one deft cut. In that uneasy calm before the storm, the seeds of Cromwell's undoing lay quietly buried within the very edifice of Tudor reform. When Thomas Cromwell was created Earl of Essex in the year 1540, it seemed that nothing could stand in the way of his rising power. He had decisively crushed the Pilgrimage of Grace rebellion, extinguishing every spark of religious dissent. He had mastered the perilous chessboard of King Henry's matrimonial shifts, and he had outmaneuvered rival factions so thoroughly that even the oldest noble houses looked upon him with envy and resentment. In the hush of his newly acquired estates, Cromwell might have allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. But the wheels of fortune were already beginning to turn. One of Cromwell's boldest diplomatic gambits involved forging an alliance with the Protestant princes of Germany through the proposed marriage of Henry VIII to Anne of Cleves. On paper, the match was brilliant. It bound England to a powerful bloc opposed to the Pope's influence and promised fresh trade opportunities. Yet King Henry, ever capricious, expected to behold a radiant bride based on Hans Holbein's flattering portrait when he first met Anne in the cold light of January, 1540. He was mortified. His brusque remark that she was as plain as a maid of Bretagne stung Cromwell's carefully laid plans and sowed seeds of doubt in the king's fickle mind. The Conservative faction, led by Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, seized upon Henry's disappointment. Like wolves circling wounded prey, they whispered that Cromwell had willfully deceived the king, that his affinity for Protestant reforms amounted to treason against the true faith. Norfolk produced diplomatic letters, once harmless exchanges with Lutheran contacts, and reframed them as evidence of collusion with foreign heretics. The very papers Cromwell had used to shore up alliances were now paraphernalia for his undoing. Each communiqué, each treaty draft, became a dagger aimed at his reputation. On the 10th day of June, in the year 1540, the long-expected catastrophe arrived during a routine meeting of the King's Privy Council. The chamber, usually alive with debate over tariffs or church revenues, fell into a deathly silence as the Duke of Norfolk rose to read the charges against Cromwell heresy, treason, and a host of nebulous offences that required no proof beyond the council's decree. Cromwell, once accustomed to controlling such proceedings, found himself caught like prey in the very legal snare he had perfected. His ceremonial garter, symbol of royal favour, was snapped in two. His sword, a sign of noble status, was wrenched from his side, and iron shackles clamped about his wrists mocked his former authority. Escorted in silence to the Tower of London, Cromwell endured a torment of the mind as acute as any physical pain. Letters he had penned in service to the crown were excerpted and distorted, read aloud as damning proof of conspiracy. Friends who had once sought his patronage turned away with lowered eyes. Unwilling to risk association, he was compelled, in a final bitter irony, to draft the legal instruments that would annul the very marriage he had negotiated with Anne of Cleves, a project that had sealed his fate. Stripped of titles, stripped of property, he awaited the parliamentary bill of attainder that would formalise his condemnation without trial or recourse. The morning of the 28th day of July, 1540, dawned bright and cruel. As King Henry married the young and vivacious Catherine Howard, his fifth queen, the scaffold at Tower Hill was readied for Cromwell's execution. Crowds gathered to witness the spectacle on one side, the promise of regal celebration. On the other, the grim embodiment of Cromwell's downfall. A hush fell as the once mighty Earl ascended the platform in his shackles, his gaze steady, his hands bound, and the echo of courtly applause mingling eerily with the clank of iron. In his final moments, Cromwell delivered a brief, measured speech void of protest or bitterness that acknowledged human frailty, prayed for the king's welfare, and sought divine mercy. Then, with the sharp fall of the executioner's axe, the life of England's most formidable minister ended in a single stroke. His head, severed from his body, was displayed yet again, as a warning to all who would dare to concentrate too much power, and perhaps too much trust, in a single individual. Thus ended the rise and ruin of Thomas Cromwell, Earl of Essex. No longer the architect of statecraft, he became an object lesson in the Tudor court. Even the mightiest servant could become the most expendable pawn. In the stillness that followed, Tower Hill stood silent once more, a stage upon which the caprice of royal favour had played out its final, merciless act. When Thomas Cromwell's carefully plotted marriage alliance with Anne of Cleves collapsed in ignominy, he unwittingly stepped into the crosshairs of the conservative faction led by Thomas Howard. The Duke of Norfolk, along with other high-ranking Catholic peers who still smarted from the loss of monastic estates, quietly nurtured their resentment of Cromwell's vigorous Protestant reforms. They saw in the king's infatuation with Norfolk's own young niece, Catherine Howard, the perfect opportunity to undercut Cromwell's standing. Henry's ardent admiration for Catherine, her laughter, her grace, her youth offered them a pretext to suggest that Cromwell had duped the king with Holbein's flattering portrait of Anne, thus compromising both his heart and his diplomatic acumen. Norfolk and his allies set in motion a campaign of subtle defamation that unfolded like a slow, creeping fog. They collected every snippet of Cromwell's erstwhile diplomatic correspondence letters detailing negotiations with the German princes, memoranda on trade agreements that once testified to his skill, and began to twist each phrase into a narrative of conspiracy. Where once Cromwell had been applauded for forging Protestant alliances, now the same documents were brandished as proof of his clandestine collusion with foreign heretics. Even Bishop Stephen Gardiner, a respected ecclesiastic once content to quarrel in sermons, lent his voice to the chorus of denunciation, asserting that Cromwell had allowed dangerous doctrines to spread, thereby undermining the king's divine right to govern. All the while, Cromwell remained consumed by the labyrinth of annulment law, poring over obscure clauses that might secure Anne's consent to a swift divorce. He laboured late into the candlelit hours, convinced that a legally sound verdict would restore the king's favour and silence his detractors. But the machinations of Norfolk's faction had been arranged with painstaking precision. Word of Cromwell's supposed duplicity filtered into the king's private councils like poison, corroding Henry's trust bit by bit. The very monarch who had once praised Cromwell's brilliance now cast furtive glances, his expressions shifting between irritation and doubt. Within the confines of court, the tension grew almost palpable. Those who owed their rise to Cromwell's patronage sensed the shifting wind. Gentlemen who had eagerly sought his recommending nod now lowered their gazes, their voices dropping when his name arose. Whispers of caution passed from lips in dimly lit corridors. Beware Cromwell's ear. He knows your secrets. He sits closest to the king. In such hushes lay the seeds of betrayal, sown by fear and ambition in equal measure. Before long, the very doors that had swung open for Cromwell were bolted shut. Servants in hushed tones parted from his path. Councillors once eager for his strategic insight made excuses to avoid his chambers. Even the Queen's ladies-in-waiting seemed to flit past him in silent alarm. Each curt nod, each hesitant half-smile, whispered volumes. The man who had once championed the king's will was now an unwelcome echo of policy and power. Cromwell, despite his formidable intellect, did not detect the subtle choreography of exclusion until the final act drew near. Caught between his steadfast loyalty to Henry and the malice of his foes, Cromwell found himself in a precarious bind. His entreaties to the king, delivered in carefully measured counsel, were misconstrued as self-serving appeals. Every explanation he offered simply furnished Norfolk's faction with fresh material for accusation. When he insisted that his reforms served only the realm's stability and the monarch's glory, they answered with murmurs that he sought dominion over the throne itself. And so, the foundation of Cromwell's supremacy, his unassailable position at Henry's side, began to fracture. Allies he had once elevated to prominence turned away, sealing letters with abrupt finality, slipping from his confidence like shadows fleeing the dawn. The structural integrity of his authority, painstakingly erected through years of legal innovation and administrative overhaul, began to waver under the weight of cynicism and fear. In those waning days, Cromwell's world contracted to a series of solitary chambers and echoing hallways. Gone were the bustling councils and robust debates. Instead, there reigned a ghostly hush, where once the air had hummed with policy and power. Cromwell, who had mastered the art of statecraft, now felt his mastery slip through his fingers like sifted sand. It was as if the very instruments of governance he had constructed now turned against him. Each statute and report becoming a footnote in the indictment he could not forestall. Thus, Thomas Cromwell, architect of the modern English state, found himself ensnared by the same legal and intelligence networks he had perfected. His last chamber in Westminster might as well have been a vaulted tomb, where the echoes of his own decrees mocked him. The man who had bent church and court to his will was left reeling in the cruel irony of his own making. Caught in the labyrinth of suspicion he had helped to design, and in that sombre stillness, as shadows lengthened along stone corridors, Cromwell understood that even the most formidable power can falter under the weight of unrelenting intrigue. As Thomas Cromwell strode into the Privy Council chamber at Westminster on the 10th of June, 1542, his bearing was calm and familiar. He had presided over these meetings countless times, guiding discussions on taxation, foreign policy, and the governance of distant shires. Yet on that still morning, the usual rustle of robes and soft murmur of officials gave way to a sudden hush as Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, rose to his feet. Norfolk unfolded a lengthy parchment and, with an austere precision, began to read aloud a litany of charges that Cromwell had propagated heretical doctrine, colluded with foreign powers, and usurped the king's will through forged papers. The accusations heresy, treason, even murder were detailed, yet deliberately vague, leaving Cromwell little ground on which to mount a defence. Across the chamber, those who once owed their fortunes to Cromwell's patronage sat frozen as stone statues. Gentlemen whose gilded seals had authenticated his reforms dared not meet his eyes, for any show of solidarity might brand them complicit in the alleged conspiracy. It was in that grave silence, broken only by the Duke of Norfolk's clear, unwavering voice, that Cromwell grasped the painful irony, the very tactics he had perfected his network of informants, his arsenal of secret memoranda. His skill at exposing enemies were now being turned against him. When Cromwell finally spoke, it was with measured dignity, insisting upon his loyalty to the king and his faith in the law he himself had shaped. But Norfolk would not be swayed. With abrupt authority, he motioned to the guards. Chains were clamped upon Cromwell's wrists. His ceremonial sword, once a symbol of noble rank, was struck from his hip, and the blue ribbon of the Order of the Garter was plucked from his breast, torn asunder before the assembled council. In mere moments, the man who had wielded the machinery of state like a master craftsman became a prisoner stripped of his titles and reduced to a criminal in the eyes of the realm. The spectacle of Cromwell's arrest was conducted with chilling efficiency, an unmistakable warning to any who might contemplate dissent. Tower guards, stern and unyielding, escorted him through the corridor that led from the council chamber to Whitehall Gate. Courtiers and servants craned their necks in astonishment as the procession passed. Some whispered in hushed awe, while others broke into nervous laughter at the sight of the fallen minister. Word of the arrest rippled through London faster than any royal decree. Citizens poured into the streets, eager to glimpse the man labelled the traitor. Some jeered and pointed, their voices rising in a chorus of scorn. Others watched in uneasy silence, struck by a profound sense of the crown's unmatched power. Before sunset, Thomas Cromwell found himself confined within the grim walls of the Tower of London, a fortress whose ancient stones had borne silent witness to the doom of many who had dared challenge royal authority. Where once he had dispatched countless souls into its dungeons, he now faced those same shadowed cells. His lodgings were a sparse chamber of stone, lit by a single narrow window set high in the wall. The comforts of his former life, sumptuous meals, richly appointed quarters, and the company of trusted advisers were replaced by a thin blanket, a coarse wool tunic, and a solitary wooden stool. The once sharp angles of Cromwell's face, so accustomed to discerning policy and plotting strategy, softened into weariness. His beard, once trimmed with precision, sprouted grey in irregular patches. His dark eyes, which had glinted with the fire of ambition, now reflected only anxiety and doubt. As he paced the tiny room, Cromwell's mind no longer raced with plans to restructure the church or rebalance the treasury. Instead, he grappled with a mounting dread of the unknown day of reckoning. Would he stand trial before peers, or would a parliamentary bill of attainder pronounce his guilt without defence? Cromwell's few attempts to communicate with the outside world were met with rigid scrutiny. Letters to his son, Gregory, and entreaties to his sister Elizabeth were intercepted, stripped of their substance, and rewritten into bland reports that concealed any message of comfort or hope. In those muffled correspondences, Cromwell realised that the justice he had once administered with ruthless efficiency was nowhere to be found. Politics had become a cold instrument of survival, one wielded by enemies who had studied his every move and learned well how to emulate his tactics. In the profound stillness of his cell, broken only by the distant toll of bells and the occasional footfall of a passing guard, Cromwell confronted a stark truth. The edifice of power he had so carefully constructed could crumble overnight. He recalled corridors of influence where secrets flowed like gold, chambers where his voice carried the weight of the crown, and banquets where alliances were forged. Now, silence reigned where debate once flourished, and shadows usurped the spaces where light of purpose had shone. As the chamberlain's footsteps receded and the heavy iron door clanged shut, sealing Cromwell within a fortress designed for either sanctuary or imprisonment, the former minister was left to ponder the ultimate cost of ambition. He who had risen from the forge-lit streets of Putney to the pinnacle of English power now faced nothing but the cold company of stone walls and his own unquiet thoughts. In that hushed, sombre hour, Cromwell understood that he had been undone, not by a single foe, but by an entire system of loyalty and law turned against its master, a system he had once believed could be moulded for the good of the realm, but which now served only as the instrument of his ruin. In the cold, damp shadows of his tower cell, Thomas Cromwell endured torments that reached far beyond the flesh. Gone were the elegant garments and sumptuous tapestries of courtly life. He now wore a coarse woolen tunic, its rough fibres chafing against his skin. His bed consisted of a simple plank of wood, unadorned and unforgiving. A single, narrow window, high above, admitted just enough light to mark the passage of day into night. In that muted glow, Cromwell reflected that silence had been his greatest weapon, yet now the very tools he had wielded with such mastery, the secret intelligence and forensic legal arguments, were arrayed against him like a silent army of accusation. His interrogations were conducted not in the pitiless style of barbaric torture, but under the guise of administrative inquiry. Scraps of his own diplomatic correspondence letters he had commissioned to cement alliances were exhumed, each phrase dissected and reframed as evidence of treason. "You wrote this," peered the interrogators, thrusting a page under his nose. "You meant this?" And thus, with every signature he had affixed in service of the realm, Cromwell found himself coerced into endorsing the very charges that condemned him. To refuse was to court physical torment. To comply meant living beneath the weight of falsehood. Worse than these distortions was the deafening absence of any word from the king. Henry VIII, once effusive in his praise, who had relied on Cromwell as his most astute counsellor, now bestowed nothing but silence. No letter of clemency, no whispered reassurance, only the echo of a crown that had turned its gaze away. In Tudor political culture, such regal indifference spoke volumes. It was as sharp as any sword, severing hope and leaving Cromwell to realise that he was no longer needed. Yet, in this murk of despair, a faint ember of purpose flickered. Cromwell's intimate knowledge of the contractual intricacies binding Anne of Cleves to Henry had become crucial once more. His captors, needing to dissolve that ill-fated marriage to pave the way for a new union with Catherine Howard, grudgingly sought his expertise. They summoned him to draft fresh annulment terms. Recognizing that his negotiating skill and continental contacts were unmatched, Cromwell clung to this final assignment as if it were a lifeline, an opportunity to cling to relevance and possibly sway the king's judgment. But he understood, all too keenly, that his value was measured only until the task was done. He would be cast aside the moment his knowledge had served its purpose. Within the grey walls of the Tower, Cromwell felt betrayal pressing in from every side. Former allies, once elevated by his patronage, now moulded themselves into fashionable neutrality, fearful of any association that might tarnish their own standing. Advisers who had whispered counsel at his elbow now feigned ignorance of his whereabouts. Even his beloved son, Gregory, could offer only brief, censored notes of encouragement, letters subjected to the same ruthless scrutiny. Their sentiments reduced to hollow phrases, safe enough to pass through the censor's pens. Alone with his thoughts, Cromwell confronted the bitter revelation that the pinnacle of power had been supported by a foundation of shifting loyalties. He had taught the realm that knowledge and influence could change the course of nations. Yet, in his own hour of need, those very teachings had been weaponized by men eager to protect themselves. The realization that he had become an exemplar of his own cautionary doctrines weighed heavily upon him. The toll of isolation and suspicion etched deep lines into his face. And in the dim solitude of his cell, Cromwell wrestled with a remorse that would never quite release its grip. Night after night, the damp stone walls seemed to close in, and Cromwell found himself drifting into uneasy half-sleep. Memories of councils in candlelit chambers, of eager scribes taking down his every word, of triumphant proclamations resonated like distant echoes. Yet each recollection brought with it the stark reminder that all those grand designs and reforms had led him here. Stripped of rank, and facing a fate he had once dispensed to others, the cruel paradox, the instrument of Tudor administration, whose innovations had shaped a kingdom, was now but a shattered instrument of his own undoing. In that enduring gloom, Thomas Cromwell's spirit hovered between despair and reluctant acceptance. He had once believed that through law, intelligence, and unwavering service to the crown, one might carve a secure place in history. Now, he understood that power in Henry's England was ephemeral, as fleeting as the breath one drew in these stifling confines. Surrounded by betrayal and manipulated by those he had helped empower, Cromwell lay awake, acutely conscious that the final stroke against him would soon be delivered by a system he himself had refined, and that, in the cold calculus of the Tudor court, even the most indispensable soul could be forsaken without a second thought. Without a formal trial to plead his case, Thomas Cromwell was condemned by an act known as a Bill of Attainder. This grim legal mechanism empowered Parliament to declare a man guilty of treason without presenting evidence or allowing defence. In a single stroke, Cromwell's estates were seized, his titles stripped away, and his fate fixed. He was to face the executioner's axe on the 28th day of July, 1540, the very day King Henry VIII would wed his new queen, Catherine Howard. The cruel synchronicity of these events added a dramatic flourish to an already dark chapter of Tudor history. As the great hall of Whitehall roared with the celebration of royal marriage, Tower Hill prepared to host the final act in the life of the man who had designed the kingdom's matrimonial laws. The contrast was more vivid than any fresco, more biting than a sonnet's twist. Cromwell, the architect of policy, had laid the foundations for divorce and annulment. Now, those same statutes sentenced him to death. It was a bitter lesson in the double-edged nature of power. In the days that followed, Cromwell awaited his grim rendezvous with destiny. From the damp gloom of his cell, he was led each morning through narrow passageways that echoed with the clack of his iron shackles. Word of his coming execution spread through London like wildfire. Citizens crowded the streets leading to Tower Hill, eager to glimpse the fallen minister, some murmuring prayers, others whispering curses. It was, in its own perverse way, a spectacle of mass participation in the theatre of power. On the morning of his execution, Cromwell stood upon the scaffold, visible to thousands who had gathered below. His clothes, once the finery of the state's chief counsellor, were now the coarse garments of a condemned man. Reports of the day describe him as gaunt and weary, his face drawn, eyes fixed on the sky, as though seeking mercy from some higher court. He stood shivering in the chill breeze, his heart surely pounding like a distant drum. And yet, there was a calm composure about him, a resignation that bespoke a man who had long prepared for this moment. Though his peers might have expected the full horrors of traitor's death, hanging, drawing, and quartering, Cromwell was granted the privilege of beheading, reserved for nobles of his rank. It was, perhaps, the smallest mercy the crown could concede. In his final moments, he addressed the onlookers in a brief speech. He made no protestations of innocence, no impassioned pleas for clemency. Instead, he spoke humbly of human frailty, acknowledged his sins as common to all men, and offered prayers for the king and the realm. His voice, though faint, carried a dignity that silenced the crowd. Then came the moment so long awaited. The executioner raised his axe high, and with a single, downward stroke, severed the life of the once powerful earl. The head fell, and for an instant, the world seemed to pause. Only the rustle of silken gowns on the scaffold and the distant murmur of the crowd breaking the hush. Cromwell, who had shaped the kingdom's laws and wielded its mightiest instruments, found his legacy distilled into a single, stark image: the headless corpse, the newly severed head to be displayed on London Bridge. It was the ultimate reminder of royal supremacy, a lesson served cold for any who might challenge the crown. In the weeks after his death, the Tudor court carried on with its familiar rhythms of feasting, plotting, and power. Henry VIII, having married his fifth queen, soon shifted his attention to matters of state and pleasure, as was his wont. But the effects of Cromwell's reforms, both the monstrous and the magnificent, could not be undone so swiftly. Though his intelligence network lay dismantled, his administrative reforms continued to give shape to England's government. His statutes remained on the books, guiding the young scholars who would refine them in generations to come. The dissolution of the monasteries, for all its brutality, altered the social fabric of England. New landowners emerged, the crown's revenues swelled, and the absence of monastic charity forced the state to develop new systems of poor relief. The centralization of legal authority under the crown, the modernization of record-keeping, the rigorous auditing of revenue, all bore Cromwell's imprint. These legacies, though tarnished by his ignominious end, quietly steered England toward an age of stronger central governance and, eventually, commercial expansion. Thus, Cromwell's death, while a politically expedient demonstration of absolute power, could not erase the deep grooves he carved into the machinery of statecraft. Future monarchs and ministers might have unkind words for the man himself, but they could not escape the structures he had set in place. In the long echo of history, his reforms endured, outlasting the transient fury of courtly revenge. And so, in the twilight hush that followed his execution, the kingdom moved on, changed forever by the architect who had risen and fallen by the very laws he had wrought. In the end, Thomas Cromwell's life and death stand as a meditation on the perils of ambition and the impermanence of favour. He built a system capable of shaping nations, yet succumbed to the very forces he had unleashed. His story lingers as a reminder in the corridors of power. The highest heights can give way to the lowest depths in a single, merciless stroke. After Thomas Cromwell's meteoric rise and tragic fall, the echoes of his life continued to ripple through England and beyond. In the weeks following his execution, public opinion split sharply. Some among the populace rejoiced that the blasphemer had finally been brought to justice, believing divine retribution had at last been meted out. Others, however, watched in silent horror. For Cromwell's demise was a stark reminder that no man, no matter how close to the throne, could be certain of his safety. Murmurs of unease circulated in drawing rooms and taverns alike. If Cromwell could fall, who among us is truly secure? Across the Channel, foreign diplomats recorded every nuance of the affair in meticulous dispatches. In Paris, French envoys noted that the Tudor court's instability made England an unreliable ally. In Rome, papal nuncios celebrated the downfall of England's principal architect of Reformation, seeing in his death proof that God's justice prevailed over heresy. Meanwhile, in the German principalities, Protestant leaders, the very men Cromwell had courted, grew anxious at the thought that their champion could so swiftly become a victim of the very system he had shaped. Over time, historians have offered variegated interpretations of Cromwell's legacy. Early chroniclers of the Catholic tradition decried him as an arrogant usurper, a man who overstepped his station and brought ruin upon himself. Conversely, Protestant apologists lauded him as a pathfinder, the visionary who propelled England out of medieval darkness and into a new age of national sovereignty. Diplomatic records presented yet another facet Cromwell as a pragmatic politician, one more concerned with consolidating royal power than with any genuine religious conviction. To them, he was neither saint nor fanatic, but a master of realpolitik who used religious upheaval as a means to strengthen the crown. By the 20th century, scholarship had moved toward a more nuanced portrait. Modern historians portrayed Thomas Cromwell not as a simple angel or a devil, but as a complex product of his era. He understood better than most the workings of a modern state, building an intelligence network to rival continental powers, harnessing propaganda to shape public opinion, and wielding parliament and statute law as weapons more potent than any sword. Cromwell grasped that a united legislative body could serve as a more effective instrument of control than armies on the march. Yet the very system he erected proved to be a double-edged sword. In granting the crown near absolute authority, legally sanctioned through attainders and supremacy acts, Cromwell unknowingly forged the instruments of his own demise. When Henry VIII's trust wavered, no safeguard remained to protect Cromwell from the legal machinery he had so carefully refined. In that ruthless calculation of Tudor politics, one's head might roll as easily as another's. And Cromwell, despite his towering intellect, learned this lesson far too late. Today, Cromwell's enduring lesson stands as a timeless admonition in politics. The construction of robust, balanced institutions far outweighs the reliance on any single individual. No matter how gifted or loyal, one mortal cannot bear the full weight of governance alone. It is the stability of the framework laws, checks and balances, transparent administration that ensures lasting order. Thomas Cromwell's life, from the humble forge of Putney to the scaffold of Tower Hill, reminds us that although individuals may shape history, it is the structures they create that sustain it. Thus, in the wake of his downfall, England gradually absorbed the wisdom of Cromwell's contradictions. The centralization and professionalization he championed were tempered with mechanisms for accountability and shared governance. Over centuries, these adjustments steered the nation toward more resilient forms of administration, preventing the kind of unchecked authority that had doomed Cromwell himself. His tragic arc from blacksmith's son to earl, then to condemned traitor, became a parable for all who would wield power build for the many, not the one. Fortify institutions, not personalities. As the mists of Tudor history settled into memory, Cromwell's spectral presence lingered in statutes and archives. His reforms, though born of ambition, laid the groundwork for modern bureaucracy. His intelligence systems evolved into structured networks of information gathering. His legal precedents, once instruments of execution, served later generations in pursuits of justice rather than vengeance. And so, through the tragedy and tumult of his career, Thomas Cromwell left behind a nation wiser to the dangers of concentrated power and more committed to the enduring strength of its institutions. Right after the 28th day of July, in the year 1540, when the axe had fallen upon Thomas Cromwell, the Tudor court entered a new era of upheaval. King Henry VIII, scarcely able to contain his triumph at having gained a fifth queen, joined the courtly revelry in honour of Catherine Howard's arrival. Lavish feasts were laid out. Trumpets heralded the latest alliance, and the very halls that echoed Cromwell's final footsteps now thrummed with celebration. Yet, amidst the glittering banquets and swirls of silk, a peculiar emptiness gripped the king's heart. Whispers among his closest counsellors revealed that Henry himself admitted to ruefully acknowledging a grave mistake by letting Cromwell's head fall without warning. "We severed the hand that steadied the realm's policies and coffers." Indeed, the royal treasury, which had once swelled with the spoils of the dissolution of the monasteries, began to whisper its lament. The vast sums that Cromwell had marshalled into the king's coffers, money once drawn from church lands, were no longer replenished with the same efficiency. The new men appointed to collect customs duties and oversee taxes struggled to match the former minister's mastery of fiscal policy. Shipments lingered unpaid at London docks, starved of the streamlined oversight that Cromwell had enforced. Regional sheriffs, uncertain of the new protocols, failed to submit accurate levies, leaving the king once again forced to issue royal bonds to cover the shortfall, a burden passed on to merchants who grumbled of rising interest rates and to wealthy nobles who found their estates pressed for new loans. Meanwhile, within the walls of Whitehall and Hampton Court, the conservative faction that had orchestrated Cromwell's downfall discovered it lacked the unifying vision essential to governance. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, though a master intriguer, found himself ill-equipped to replace Cromwell's blend of legal expertise and administrative acumen. He could rally fellow Catholics to denounce heresy, but he could not quell the sparks of rebellion that still flared in remote counties. He could mount fierce denunciations in the House of Lords, but he lacked the diplomatic finesse to negotiate with King Charles of Spain, or to calm the anxieties of Rome. In short, Norfolk had seized Cromwell's throne in the court of public opinion. Yet he stumbled when asked to fill the vacated seat of statecraft. Religion, too, swayed as if caught in a tempest. The reforms Cromwell had championed, abolishing certain rights, redistributing monastic endowments, enforcing the royal supremacy, lost momentum. In cathedral aisles and parish churches, conservative clergy seized the moment to reassert long-silenced traditions. Small communities petitioned to reopen their local convents or chapels, obtaining charters that allowed limited communal worship and alms. The grand momentum of the English Reformation, once driven by Cromwell's unrelenting force, slowed to a faltering walk. King Henry, caught between his self-styled role as supreme head of the Church of England and the need to placate Catholic sympathisers at court, issued a patchwork of decrees that shifted like shifting tides. One day he would command an edict against papist images. The next, he would ban rural preachers, suspected of radical zeal. Such inconsistency bred confusion among clergy and laity alike. In these turbulent months, the court's missing linchpin became apparent. Cromwell had embodied the rare skill of mediator, able to balance the king's personal desires, the demands of reformers, and the traditions of old nobility. He had woven the various strands of interest into a single tapestry of policy. Now, with his absence, the tapestry unravelled. Factions that once whispered in secret now battled openly for influence. Those seeking to restore former monastic privileges aligned with those who yearned for a complete return to papal obedience. They clashed with merchants who prized Cromwell's economic innovations and urged further commercial expansion. The common people, unsure of what doctrine or levy might next be imposed, murmured in village taverns, awaiting any semblance of clear guidance. This rough and tumble of hands-off politics forced everyone to confront a new reality. The Tudor government could no longer depend on a single individual to steer the ship of state. Councils that once deferred to a single, commanding authority now skittered from proposal to proposal, rarely reaching a firm conclusion. The machinery of governance, for a brief but acute moment, seemed to groan and stall under its own weight, as if longing for the deft touch of the man who had once orchestrated its every gear and lever. Thus, the post-Cromwell era revealed itself as a crucible of instability. The court's rich tapestry of titles and honours no longer concealed the gaping hole left by the fallen Earl, for the first time since Cromwell's rise. The Tudor monarchy confronted the unsettled prospect that its own structures might prove insufficient without a singular steward at their helm. Generals and bishops, scribes and sheriffs, all sensed they must adapt to a world where the certainty of Cromwell's guiding star had been extinguished, leaving them to navigate the shifting shadows of power on their own. This was an unprecedented challenge, governance with bare hands, as it were an unsettling experiment in the absence of the very architect who had once defined the realm's course. News of Thomas Cromwell's execution spread through England like a mournful bell, and soon the continent was alive with commentary. In Rome, the papal court celebrated the downfall of the man they had long viewed as a heretic and a usurper. Cardinals toasted to what they called the fiery cauldron of justice, served to one who dared challenge the primacy of the Holy See. Stained glass windows, lit by flickering candles, seemed to shine more brightly as priests offered prayers of thanksgiving. Convinced that divine favour had returned to Christendom, in the bustling courts of Spain, Emperor Charles V watched the events unfold with keen satisfaction. To him, England's moment of weakness offered a rare opportunity to restore a traditional Catholic alliance. He dispatched missives to the German electors, urging them to recall that England's Protestant experiment had lost its chief architect, and that the balance of power had shifted decisively in the favour of Rome. Let it be known, his envoys declared, that the support once promised to the Reformation from London must now be considered but a vain hope. Farther north, the Protestant principalities of the Holy Roman Empire reeled from Cromwell's demise. These small Lutheran states, which had relied upon his deft diplomacy to check the influence of both Vienna and Madrid, suddenly found themselves adrift. Cromwell's grand plan for a Protestant coalition anchored by English gold and political will collapsed with his beheading. Princes who had once negotiated with England on near equal footing now scrambled to secure their own defences or reopen talks with Catholic Habsburgs. Delegations moved from court to court, imploring King Henry to maintain a policy of religious moderation, but lacking Cromwell's persuasive authority, they found little ear for their appeals. In Paris, King Francois I surveyed these developments with strategic intent. He noted, with a calculating eye, the administrative void left by Cromwell's absence. France, long the rival of England across the Channel, could now press its advantage. The French crown offered covert support to English dissidents, while pressing its own claims in the northern seas, where fishing rights and trade routes were hotly contested. French diplomats, with subtlety perfected by decades of courtly manoeuvre, secured favourable terms in negotiations over the North Sea fisheries terms that might have been unattainable under Cromwell's more disciplined hand. To the north still, the Kingdom of Scotland, bound by the ancient Old Alliance to France, sensed an opening to press old claims along the border. Scottish raiding parties, emboldened by reports of chaos south of Hadrian's Wall, intensified their incursions, seizing livestock and burning farmsteads in the northern English shires. The expense of mustering defences, of deploying royal musters to repel these skirmishes, strained Henry's treasury further. The king, already coping with shortfalls from the dissolved monasteries and the absence of Cromwell's fiscal acumen, was forced to levy additional contributions from his nobles, provoking fresh resentment and adding to the general unease that clung to Whitehall's walls. Thus, the death of Thomas Cromwell reverberated far beyond the Tower's stones. It shattered the fragile Protestant alliance and handed renewed momentum to the Catholic camp. It altered the diplomatic calculus in Vienna, Paris, and Madrid, prompting all sides to re-examine their ententes with the English crown. Even the smallest German duchy, once a mere footnote in the annals of Reformation politics, found itself negotiating anew for survival, in a world where Cromwell's guiding hand no longer steadied the balance. In summary, Cromwell's fall was not merely the tragedy of a single courtier, but a continental earthquake. His execution rent the delicate fabric of European power, leaving each state to salvage what it could. Spain and Rome celebrated and extended their influence, while France and Scotland moved swiftly to claim advantage. The Protestant princes, bereft of their English champion, faced the stark reality of isolation. In all this flux, the indispensable role Cromwell had played as both a domestic reformer and an international diplomat became painfully clear. He had been a linchpin of Tudor foreign policy, a nearly irreplaceable intermediary among the great houses of the Renaissance world. As the dust settled, rulers on every side realized they must fill the void left by Cromwell, or risk succumbing to the very anarchy his reforms had sought to prevent. And so, in the uneasy calm that succeeded the storm, the legacy of Thomas Cromwell endured proof that even the mightiest of men can be toppled. Yet their vision can shape the course of nations long after they have fallen. Not long after Thomas Cromwell's death, the English court found itself mired in an institutional crisis. The absence of a masterful reformer left the machinery of governance creaking and sputtering. The audit offices, once disciplined under Cromwell's exacting standards, now produced overlapping and contradictory reports. Customs duties were misrecorded. Excise taxes went uncollected, and the registers of monastic lands once so meticulously maintained fell into disarray. Without Cromwell's guiding hand, departemental silos multiplied, and law codes accumulated errors, as successive clerks copied and recopied flawed statutes. Meanwhile, many new appointments to key offices were handed out as political rewards, rather than on merit, swelling the ranks of underqualified officials. The treasury, starved of reliable revenue streams, quickly dwindled, forcing King Henry VIII to levy fresh taxes upon both nobility and urban merchants. Grumbling nobles gritted their teeth at the rising assessments, while London traders murmured discontent in taverns, lamenting that their loyalty was being taxed beyond endurance. This concentration of power in Cromwell's singular genius had always posed a risk. He himself had warned the king that the strength of a system is greater than the affection for any one man. Yet his reforms, so revolutionary, had become too dependent on his personal authority. With his passing, no other individual possessed his comprehensive vision to sustain order. The manner in which Cromwell's own attainder had been processed cast a chilling pall over the bureaucracy. Officials grew timid, terrified that bold initiatives might mark them as potential traitors. Thus emerged a climate of executive fear. Subordinates hesitated to propose meaningful innovations, while superiors quailed at the thought of empowering anyone else. This administrative paralysis persisted through the final years of Henry's reign and into the early years of Edward VI. When the boy king ascended the throne, his regency council faced a fractured government. In desperation, they summoned back several of Cromwell's former advisors, men now reintegrated from obscurity despite their diminished clout. These veterans, though depleted of their former influence, set about restructuring the royal finances on a model reminiscent of the Spanish hacienda. Power, they reasoned, should not rest in a single pair of hands, but in collective, rotating committees. Responsibilities once vested in one Chancellor of the Exchequer were divided among several commissioners. Audit functions now required multiple signatories to verify accounts. Yet even these adjustments came slowly, hampered by the lingering distrust seeded in Cromwell's downfall. As the historian William Camden later observed, England paid dearly for tearing out a root as deep as Cromwell's, without planting a stronger system in its place. From Cromwell's tragic legacy arose a profound lesson: when governance leans too heavily on the charisma or skill of an individual, the entire structure is vulnerable to collapse upon that person's removal. Conversely, a robust and flexible institutional framework will endure leadership changes with far less turmoil. Modern scholars often argue that Cromwell's original reforms, revolutionary as they were, should have been accompanied by explicit checks and balances, clear delineations of authority, mechanisms for review, and rotating tenures would have forestalled the over-concentration of power that ultimately proved his undoing. In the decades following Cromwell's death, the English court gradually acknowledged the need for civil service reforms. Provosts of the Exchequer, once appointed at the king's whim, were required to serve fixed terms. Regional commissioners of musters and tax collectors were subject to peer review by neighbouring counties, judicial circuits were standardised, and commissions of oyer and terminer were convened only with collective oversight. The Privy Council itself instituted a rotational presidency, ensuring that no single minister could dominate its proceedings unchecked. These incremental changes, though hard-won, laid the groundwork for a more resilient state apparatus. Over time, these institutional safeguards bore fruit. By the reign of Elizabeth I, the English government had evolved into a more stable, professional bureaucracy. The careful separation of powers between the Exchequer and the Star Chamber, between regional justices and central commissioners, helped maintain continuity even as monarchs changed. Accountability measures, such as published reports of parliamentary proceedings and the requirement for annual audits, fostered a culture of transparency that contrasted sharply with the secretive intrigues of Cromwell's era. Public confidence in the state grew, enabling Elizabeth's ministers to pursue ambitious ventures, the expansion of the navy, the sponsorship of colonial expeditions, and the patronage of a flourishing mercantile class. Thus did the chaos in the wake of Cromwell's death, once a cautionary tale of over-reliance on a single individual, transform into a catalyst for positive change. The reforms that followed his passing, though born of necessity, proved essential in ushering England into its golden age, and though Thomas Cromwell himself would be remembered as both architect and victim of his own design, his enduring impact could be felt in the steady hum of governance, a hum now supported not by the frail shoulders of one man, but by the collective strength of institutions that stood ready to weather any storm. Over the centuries, Thomas Cromwell's image has shifted with the changing tides of historical perspective. In the decades immediately following his fall, Catholic chroniclers painted him as a wicked iconoclast, a man who razed centuries of sacred tradition and defied the will of God. In their accounts, his execution was a fitting end for one who dared challenge divine authority. Every dissolution of a monastery was portrayed as an act of sacrilege, every decree separating England from Rome as a plunge into chaos. For them, Cromwell was no reformer but a villain whose death served as a moral lesson. No one escapes divine judgment. Yet as the years passed and religious passions cooled, Protestant historians in the 19th century began to cast Cromwell in a very different light. They hailed him as a visionary pioneer who tore England free from papal control, laying the groundwork for national sovereignty and the eventual rise of parliamentary democracy. In their telling, Cromwell was the architect of a modern state, whose bold realignment of church and crown opened a path toward individual liberties and constitutional government. His actions, once condemned as heretical, were reinterpreted as necessary steps on England's journey into the Enlightenment. From the late 20th century onward, scholars have taken an even more nuanced approach. Since the 1980s, biographers and political historians have acknowledged that Cromwell was neither saint nor demon, but a master of what we now call realpolitik. He understood that law and administration were the levers by which power could be consolidated and wielded with precision. Under Cromwell's guidance, information became a strategic resource, collected through an unprecedented intelligence network and analysed to preempt dissent. In political science terms, he founded the first truly professional court, foreshadowing the rise of an impersonal bureaucratic state. Recent research has further highlighted Cromwell's innovations in financial governance, He reshaped the exchequer, instituting rigorous accounting standards, demanding itemized ledgers, and enforcing the principle of individual responsibility for officials. These measures curtailed the arbitrary skimming of revenues and set benchmarks for transparent public finance. Historians today often refer to Cromwell as England's Doctor of Organisation, crediting him with laying the fiscal groundwork that would later support industrial expansion. By binding government resources with private enterprise, he ushered in a closer partnership between state and commerce, an essential precursor to the Industrial Revolution. Yet to assess Cromwell fairly, one must also acknowledge the harshness of his methods. He wielded his intelligence apparatus not only to safeguard the realm, but to silence free expression. To track and quash any opposition, dissidents faced not only legal penalties but social ruin. As Cromwell's agents monitored sermons, intercepted letters, and deployed leaks to shame or discredit adversaries, the atmosphere of surveillance he fostered bred deep resentment. Subsequent generations of officials, recalling his ruthless tactics, often hesitated to undertake sweeping reforms for fear of being branded tyrannical. In this way, Cromwell's legacy included a cycle of reprisals. The burdens of caution and suspicion he left behind stifled the very dynamism he had once championed. Cambridge historian Professor John Guy summed up this duality well. Cromwell is a tragic figure. He built the machinery of power to strengthen the state, but before he could weigh its long-term consequences, that very machinery turned on him. This observation underscores the central paradox of his career, the limits of personal power. No individual, however astute or loyal, can indefinitely maintain a system that depends so heavily on singular authority. Cromwell's fall demonstrated that sheer administrative genius, untempered by institutional checks, can prove as much a liability as a strength. Through these shifting perspectives, Cromwell emerges as both a cautionary tale and an exemplar. He showed how decisive leadership and innovative governance could reshape a nation. He also warned of the dangers inherent in concentrating too much power in one person's hands. Historians now agree that his achievements were monumental: the centralization of administration, the professionalization of government service, and the creation of a legal infrastructure that underpins modern democracy. Yet they also concede that his downfall was built into the very systems he forged. In the final reckoning, Thomas Cromwell stands as a monument to complexity. He was neither wholly hero nor villain, nor simply a footnote in Tudor drama. Instead, he was the embodiment of early modern statecraft, combining intellect, ambition, and unflinching resolve. His life invites us to reflect on the balance between innovation and restraint, between concentrated leadership and institutional resilience. Cromwell's story remains relevant. It reminds us that the architecture of power must be built not only upon the talents of individuals, but upon the firm foundations of enduring, accountable systems. And in that lesson, his legacy continues to shape our understanding of governance to this day. Finally, the story of Thomas Cromwell is not merely a personal tragedy, but a richly coloured portrait of the nature of power, policy, and humanity. Through the journey from the impoverished blacksmith's son to the powerful Earl of Essex, and then his rapid downfall into a traitor, we see that ambition and talent, though they can lift a person to the greatest heights, can also push one into the abyss if supported by no balanced, transparent system. This video offers us our first lesson: absolute power, even when placed in the hands of the wisest individual, always carries the risk of abuse and error. Cromwell demonstrated the importance of records, information, and law in governance, but also warned us that when everything depends on one person, the entire apparatus can collapse in that person's absence. Second, we learn the value of strong institutions, an administration with cross-checks, rotating appointments, and accountability will endure longer than any single actor. The temporary collapse of the English court after Cromwell's death shows that reform must go hand in hand with building a legal framework and transparent procedures to maintain long-term stability. Third, the story reminds us of the fragility of trust. Cromwell was once the king's most trusted counsellor, but a single political misstep, or the king's unpredictable emotions, was enough to cast him into doom. In life and at work, promises, reputation, and loyalty must be continually nurtured. For once trust is shaken, the consequences can be as severe as an execution. Finally, this story conveys the importance of balancing innovation with respect for tradition. Cromwell was a powerful wind of change, bringing forward progressive reforms. Yet those upheavals, if not foreseen in their social and political fallout, can provoke fierce backlash. Every new step must deftly combine a vision for the future with care for the past. Therefore, as we conclude this video, I hope you carry away 3 core values: the importance of institutional strength, the enduring value of trust and credibility, and the balance between innovation and preservation. These are the lessons Thomas Cromwell leaves us no matter the era. These principles remain timeless.